Well, hello, everybody. I'm happy to kick off the next season of the New Ideas in Insurance Law Workshop. My name is Travis Pantine. I'm co-hosting this with Professor Peter Siegelman here at the University of Connecticut Law School. This is our quad behind me as a synthetic backdrop. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. What we're aiming to do here is to draw in a diversity of thinkers from various disciplines to talk about insurance law very broadly construed. Our goal is to create a venue for conversations about insurance that's interesting not just to legal academics, but also to other academics and to lawyers and public servants and anyone else who might care about insurance. And for our first session this season, I'm very excited to welcome Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth Anderson is the Arthur Thurnau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan and the Max Shea Professor of Public Philosophy as well. I think it's fair to say, probably an understatement to say, that she's one of the most important and well-known philosophers working in the United States today. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, a Progress Medal laureate, and a recipient of the Genius Grant from the MacArthur Fellows Program. I'm sure I'm leaving off many other honors. Most recently, she published a book titled Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives in 2017 with Princeton University Press. And today she'll be presenting a part of her forthcoming book titled Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. Before I hand over the mic to Professor Anderson, a few just sort of general format announcements. We aim for about 30 minutes of presentation by the speakers and then about 30 minutes of Q&A. Peter and I will keep a queue, so just raise your hand using the function in WebEx. The session will be recorded unless the speaker requests otherwise. And a few other just quick announcements. This year we have a calendar feed, which you should be able to add into your calendar, and that'll hopefully help it make it easier for you to see when the next sessions are coming up and download the papers and join the WebEx feeds. And we're also doing a new thing, which is circulating the papers ahead of time. And so we encourage you to read those beforehand. Hopefully it'll make the conversations even richer. And then a quick teaser for our next session in 2 weeks, we'll have Catherine Wagner presenting a paper titled Adaptation and Adverse Selection in Markets for Natural Disaster Insurance. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Anderson.
Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to address you. One of my deep interests is in the history of political economy. And so I'm here to talk about the origins of the debate between individual and social insurance and how that debate is really rooted in the Protestant work ethic. So I should start off and explain what was the original Puritan work ethic. It basically is an invention of 16th and 17th century Puritans in England. And this is basically what it came to. First, we have duties that are assigned to every able-bodied person. And the duties are industry, that is disciplined work in a calling. Frugality, you have to save up, you can't waste anything. Asceticism, that is deny yourself pleasures. You have to give to charity, that is to the deserving poor. And you're also expected to maximize your wealth. He is virtuous who getteth and saveth as much as he can, said Richard Baxter, probably the most influential Puritan who pretty much invented the work ethic. Now, those sets of duties are what we typically remember today as the inheritance of the Puritan work ethic. But looking at it only on that side omits the benefits that the Puritans thought we would get from following the work ethic. So what are those benefits to everyone who follows the work ethic? Well, they're entitled to their own free choice of occupation. You don't inherit your occupation, you get to choose it. Workers are expected, entitled to receive respect as workers, no matter how lowly their occupation. They're to be honored as workers performing their duties in their station. They're entitled to a fair and living wage. If they become disabled or unable to work, they have a right to receive charity. And then in the end, they're entitled to what's known as the saints' everlasting rest. That is eternal leisure in heaven, right? They get assurance of salvation that they will get that everlasting rest in heaven. And from the Puritans' point of view, those who refused or failed to live up to the demands of the work ethic, the vicious, consisted of the following classes of people. Number one, the idle rich. This was particularly directed against the idle landlords. Number two, the predatory rich. Usurers, rack renters, people who charged such oppressive rents on the yeomen that they couldn't even survive. Monopolists, engrossers, that is, these are people who enclosed the land and kicked off the farmers, the peasants. And thirdly, beggars and criminals and other kinds of lowlifes. What happened historically was that the Industrial Revolution took place, and that fundamentally divided the work ethic. What happened really was that the Puritan model workers were simultaneously capital owners. They owned their own business. They had property entitlements of various sorts, and manual laborers. So they're both workers and capitalists together, right? The craftsmen, they would own their own shop. Even journeymen would own their own tools. Or the yeoman farmers, who they either owned their own lands or they were copy holders, so they had certain property rights in the land, long-term leases and so forth. They couldn't be easily evicted. And so from the Puritans' point of view, the duties and the benefits of the work ethic were united in the same people. The Industrial Revolution imposes a much sharper class division between capital owners on the one hand and laborers on the other, as self-sufficient, independent laborers who have some access to capital income get reduced to wage laborers who have to depend entirely on their labor to survive. And that led to a division in the work ethic between what we might call the work ethic for workers, or what I call the progressive work ethic. So the workers' work ethic still insists on the unity of the duties and the benefits, right? If you perform the duties of the work ethic, you're entitled to the benefits, the honor, the dignity, the living wages, and so forth. However, the work ethic gets secularized, and consequently people lay claim to leisure in this life, not just waiting until they die and reach heaven. And the justification for this secularized workers' work ethic is that, well, look, we're the ones who are doing all the work. Regardless of our place in the division of labor, we should be entitled to, live decently and have a decent amount of leisure. On the other hand, we have the capitalist work ethic, or what I call the conservative work ethic. And there we see a division, because really it's the property owners who claim the benefits, and the duties are all put on the workers. Because remember, the capitalists here include the landlords. They're not so interested in working. They think they're above work, right? The duties are put on the workers, and then they collect the rents. This version of the work ethic was very hostile to charity as embodied in England's poor law. And they insisted instead that everyone has to earn benefits first before they're entitled to get them. That's the earn first principle. But they still have to promise something to workers, or else why would they sign on if they only have duties? And what they promise, what the capitalists promise, is an individual opportunity to rise up in the class ranking, right? If you work hard enough, save enough, eventually you'll be able to climb from wage laborer maybe to middle class status, right? And that's the opportunity and the incentive The capitalists also favored luxury over leisure. They're very anxious about inducing a high enough supply of labor. And so they hauled out the promise of gaining luxury if only you save enough you can afford the luxuries. They're not interested in workers' leisure. They still consider that kind of idleness and sinfulness. And what's the justification for this? Well, essentially, this version of the work ethic reasons backwards, and they assume that if you're wealthy, it must be because you're virtuous. Once you license that inference, then people's relative wealth is a measure of their virtue or viciousness, right? And so it's a kind of self-justifying class inequality that gets generated. Now let's move to Priestley, who is really the pioneer in thinking about an individual private savings as a way to lift up ordinary wage laborers, essentially to middle class status. The key economic assumption that Priestley had was that under the Poor Law, which he assumed was an entitlement, that's actually an error. It was very difficult to get access to poor relief, even if one really needed it. But he assumed that the existence of the Poor Law, which rescued the destitute or some percentage of them from starvation, that very existence led to a backward bending supply curve of labor. And so if you raise wages under conditions of the Poor Law, then the workers are just going to slack off. They'll become idle because they could reach their target income quicker with higher wages. Okay, that's not a great thing from the work ethic perspective. You want the workers to be working hard. And so the objective of public policy, according to Priestley, was to bend that backward bending labor supply curve forward. And the role of luxury is basically to induce workers, to give them an incentive, if only they have a chance to accumulate enough to buy luxuries, then they're going to work really, really hard to get access to those luxuries. And that's why luxury was considered superior to leisure as a benefit to give to workers, because they'll make them work harder. Right. And so Priestley says under his mandatory individual savings plan, where every worker would have to set aside a certain percentage of their wages into their own savings plan, right, you bend the labor supply curve forward in order to induce higher levels of work and, of course, of saving. And that leads to his account of a society for the industrious poor. Okay. He has a classic critique of the Poor Law, namely that the availability of welfare payments, poverty relief to the destitute has perverse incentive effects. It leads to idleness, improvidence. They just waste their money on drink and family breakup. Fathers abandon their wife and children because they know the state will take care of them. So he was one of the people who thought that the existence of the Poor Law induced a kind of culture of poverty. Malthus, of course, was even more famous in advancing that hypothesis. Instead, he thought we should replace the Poor Law, which was a state-based entitlement. It wasn't really an entitlement. It was a chance of getting benefits. You replace that with a mandatory individual earned savings and insurance plan. So it's a little bit like modern 401ks, although financially far less sophisticated. Each individual has an account set up. They're required by the state to save for their own future needs, for old age, the prospect of disability, illness, and so forth. They earn a fixed 3% interest. And at any time, they can buy a life annuity based on the total accumulated in their savings account. Okay, the longer they wait, of course, the higher their annuity payout will be, so they have a strong incentive to wait. Priestley argued on that basis that this program would make the idle and thoughtless do for themselves what the industrious and the thoughtful are now compelled to do for them via tax payments to support the Poor Law. Now, it's something a little ironic about this because he also takes for granted that the poor are supporting the rich through their labor, namely in agriculture, of course, those desperately poor peasants are, producing all the food, which is the basis of the value of the rents that the idle landlords are collecting. So he knows that in reality, right, ordinary poor workers are supporting everybody else. And indeed, all the rich conceded that fact. Edmund Burke also, he actually was explicit in saying that it's a law of nature that the poor support the rich, and it can't be any other way. I'm going to contrast that very quickly with Tom Paine's idea, because he and the Marquis de Condorcet, pretty much at the same time during the French Revolution, invent the idea of social insurance. But Paine actually costed it out. So I think that he's got a more sophisticated view because he took England's budget and proved that the Treasury, England had a pretty impressive state capacity, revenue raising capacity. And he showed that, yeah, England could actually afford to prevent poverty by setting up a universal social insurance program. Paine and Condorcet's key insight is that the reason why people are poor is that they lack access to capital income and have to rely exclusively on their labor to support themselves. And the problem is there are all kinds of contingencies that make people unable to labor. They get too old, they get sick, disabled, accidents, right? And when that happens, you're going to end up destitute because you have no capital income to fall back on. Priestley also, in a certain way, acknowledges that, since he anticipates that his savings program might be used at any time for people who get into an accident and become disabled. However, Paine argues that once we understand that capital income is key, poverty prevention depends on everyone having a fair share of capital income. You package this in a form of social insurance against old age. You have old age pensions, survivors insurance, disability insurance, and you package the benefits in such a way that anyone who is unable to continue working then would get entitlement to social insurance payout that was enough to lift them above poverty. This would all be paid for by a 10% estate tax. So when somebody with property dies, 10% gets skipped off, and that is used to fund the social insurance program. Well, why social insurance? Why do this collectively rather than individually? Because that's really the key difference between Paine and Priestley. Paine appeals to a Lockean theory of property. According to Locke, and indeed the Puritans had the same view, God gave the earth to everyone in common originally. It was an open access commons. Anybody could use any part of the earth and gather anything from it they liked. What justifies enclosing a bit of property and making it your own is mixing your labor with it. You see that work ethic theme there, right? It's work that is the foundation of property. But people are only allowed to accumulate, to close property as long as they leave enough and it's good for other people. That's Locke's constraint. It's known as a sufficiency condition. Paine argues that the complete appropriation of land that is in England and in all the other fully settled states, not including the United States, by the way, all the land had already been appropriated, right? In England and France and so forth. And so the people who have no land then are in poverty. There's not enough left for them. And so the sufficiency condition has been violated. And that is right? A problem that needs to be solved. And Paine argues on this basis that the landowners actually owe a rent to everybody else. You know, they when you mix your labor with your land, you're entitled to keep that portion of the produce that's value added on top of the underlying natural productive capacity of the land. But right, that part that would have been produced naturally, you know, the wild berries and so forth, right, and wood or whatever would have been produced naturally by the land. That's not, you know, it wasn't the product of anybody's labor. So it used to be an open access commons. Everybody was entitled to their own fair share of it. And so landowners, in fact, owe a rent to everybody else. And that's the foundation of universal social insurance. He also argued that if that's not enough to fund social insurance, we should also consider a tax on capital gains. So the value of land, of course, was rising during the Industrial Revolution, but a lot of that increased value wasn't due to anything that the landowner had done. It's just that you have a rapidly growing economy. City of London's getting more densely populated, right? Land gets more scarce. It's not, not owing to the landowner. They haven't done anything to deserve this. It's really the surrounding uses that make that land so valuable. And so they're also not entitled to claim all the capital gains, right? So you can tax that at a higher rate to help fund social insurance. So just to summarize then, because I really want to move us to Q&A, here are the normative stakes as understood at the time. And here we're looking in the very late 18th century, the normative stakes of going for individual versus collective insurance and how that was understood at the time. Priestley believes, with the capitalist version of the work ethic, that differences in individual wealth and poverty are fundamentally caused by variations in individual virtue. How hard you work, how prudent you are in saving up your money rather than, just being a spendthrift and spending it all at once. Right, those are the key variables determining whether wealth and poverty. Malthus added to that how many kids you have, right? If you have more kids than you can afford, right, that's obviously going to make you poor. Paine's key normative idea, if you generalize it a little past just thinking about land, basically, in general terms, what he's saying is that the overall patterns of distribution of income in society are determined basically by structural economic arrangements, things like property law. Later theorists following in Paine's footsteps also focus on the division of labor, right? And, how you bundle the tasks into jobs is going to set a ceiling on people's individual productivity. Right? If you just assign somebody all unskilled tasks, they won't be able to make a high wage. And the laws regulating capital ownership also influenced this very profoundly. In those days, of course, you had primogeniture, which kept the estates intact, so the firstborn son would inherit everything, and then the later born children have to scramble for a living. So the idea was, look, inequalities in income and wealth are really due to our legal arrangements. They're not really due to individual virtue and vice. That might be a secondary cause. But in a way, the fact that the poor are with us is really due to the way we've arranged things. And it's kind of predetermined that there's going to be a lot of poor. If you divide the labor in such a way that you have masses of unskilled labor, which is, right, can't earn a high enough wage. And once we see things from Paine's point of view, given that nobody deserves these structural arrangements, we should redesign the laws in order to promote everyone's welfare and at least ensure, given that society in the Industrial Revolution is prosperous enough, any existing poverty is kind of gratuitous, socially gratuitous. We could redesign the rules of the economic gain so that at least everyone's rescued from poverty. So I'm going to leave us there and open up for Q&A, just to see what people think.
Great. Well, the queue is open. If you'd like to join it, you can just use the little raise hand function or send me a direct chat. And I'll hand it first to Peter Siegelman.
Great. So that was incredibly rich, and there's a million things I'd love to talk to you about sometime. I was saying before we started that it's eerily familiar how these debates sound now. I mean, just as you said, 401k, but you don't have to change that many vocabulary words to get the same kind of fights. So I was wondering whether you saw any evidence of the following kind of policies advocated by anybody. So one is kind of human capital. All right, workers have to do a low level work and they can't earn very much, but if we invest in their brains, then maybe there's a chance that they could know more and have skills. I mean, that's a modern notion, but was there anything that looked like a forerunner to that? The other thing is, did anybody talk about wage subsidies? Because Priestley seems like he's saying you need an IRA, you need a 401k that you put the money into. But why that? Why wouldn't society just put the money in for you? Every day that you work, we put in a pence or a shilling or whatever those numbers are, and then at some point you have this big chunk of stuff that you can cash in. So I just wondered if you saw any evidence of either of those.
Well, Adam Smith was actually the great advocate of having publicly funded schooling for workers. So he thought that, but here's the thing, is that Smith wasn't directly connecting education to higher labor productivity. In fact, his advocacy of schooling was really based on the idea that the minute division of labor that he thought was actually the cause of higher productivity, what just made work absolutely dreadful because it was mind-numbing, and because people are so exhausted from that kind of repetitive, mindless work that they don't have the energy to exercise the virtues. Right. And so like just thinking about wider affairs than just where are you going to get your next meal. And he thought that led to a disorderly and dangerous society because the workers are going to get really frustrated and maybe demand stuff that doesn't make any sense. And so he thought education would secure for workers both opportunities for more interesting ways to live, because they can now have read and think and discuss public affairs, but also that getting education would make them more respectable in the eyes of their superiors, so they wouldn't just be jerked around. Right, that enabling workers to think and speak for themselves would give them a kind of dignity and protect them from stigmatization. Human capital idea, that comes later in the 19th century, but it's not there in the late 18th.
Just to quickly follow up, is that because basically the jobs, I mean, if you were putting the heads on a pin in a pin factory, education just wasn't relevant to that. All they needed was your body and your brawn. So there was just no, like, why would we think of investing in your education except for the reasons that it makes you a better citizen or something like that? There was no link between that and actual productivity directly.
Yeah, right. They weren't really. Yeah, that's exactly right. Factory labor was a source of high productivity, but it was pretty mindless.
Great. Stephen Utz. Steve, we can't hear you if you're on mute, maybe.
Muted. I'm grateful for your overview of the philosophical development of concern for the poorly waged and hazards of wage earners. I would suggest that I've seen this in the ancestors of the income tax. Tom Paine wasn't a proponent of the income tax, but he is often cited as um, uh, seeing something that would justify imposing a tax on the wealthy that they could not pass on to the workers on the land. That was the essence of the income tax, the English income tax in the 19th century. It came in under William Pitt the Younger when England had to oppose Napoleon, but it was repealed, I think, in 1814 and restored under the Peel prime ministry. And Peel had been discussing taxation for 20 years with um, an intellectual group that met often. I don't remember their names, the name of the group right now, but the key element of John Peel's reproduction or reinstitution of income tax was that it would protect the poor and impose a duty, impose a burden on the idle wealth collectors of families. There is more detail about this, but I'll leave it at that. Let me say the English income tax was controversial through the last part of the 19th century, and it was opposed by John Stuart Mill at one point in 1851 parliamentary hearings because it would take away the wealth of the rich. Mill isn't often identified with the protection of the rich, but his father was, and he participated in these parliamentary hearings when he was still quite young. I'll leave it at that.
So that's completely fascinating. Could I ask you, the income tax, there must have been an income threshold to that tax?
Yes, it was low, and the very poor, under William Pitt the Younger, the very poor paid some income tax, but the rates were very much higher for landowners. There were the primary rich people at the time of Napoleon's attack on England. And the income tax continued to be progressive and under Sir John Peel. I would add one thing that made the income tax less progressive than it is today. Great Britain did not tax the appreciation of land over years or over a lifetime until the 20th century. But the landowners had to pay income tax on their income from the land.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about John Stuart Mill is that, boy, he was a big advocate of inheritance taxes. but I could see why, because actually Mill was a total work ethic guy. I mean, his theory of property is not that different from Locke's. It's the people who work the land who are entitled to it, and he drew pretty radical conclusions from that. So, but income taxes would be felt a little bit differently, because income taxes, if they're just based on the amount of income, don't distinguish between income that's earned from industry, say if you're an entrepreneur who's really innovating, and just passive collection of rents. So Mill really cared about that distinction precisely because of his adherence to the work ethic.
Well, Mill was on both sides of the line. He did contribute something to the recognition that taxation was lopsided in England when he was born, and certainly under William Pitt the Younger, before William Pitt the Younger's income tax. But he protected the income from the sale of from the sale of property. Property sales income was not included in the taxable base of the early British income tax.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle Logue.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Kyle.
So my question is, this is a really interesting talk. I'm familiar with your work on this and think it's really great. And I have a question that's kind of like Peter's. It's like thinking about contemporary debates that sound like this and wondering if there was any mention of it back then. So my example is, if the debates today, it continues to be debated whether or not one social welfare program or another affects people's willingness or incentive to work. And there's a lot of evidence, for example, that the guaranteed income does not reduce people's incentives to work, and actually there's some evidence for other kinds of welfare programs not having that effect. So was it just universally accepted back in the days that you're looking at, that having a poor law undermined incentives to work, and I guess was it just part of the lore, and no one, or was anyone push back and say, it turns out that some people want to do better, and their work ethic is not undermined necessarily by this?
Well, I think the critical issue, I think, back then was whether you think the supply of labor is backward or forward bending. Right. That was really the key thing, and that's what divided Priestley from somebody like Adam Smith. Right. And Smith is like the great champion of workers. This is what people like. He has such a reputation, which you actually read The Wealth of Nations. He's totally on the side of the workers. Right. He wants them to be paid more. He says, look, if you the merchants are complaining that the workers are lazy. Well, if you raise their wages, they're going to work plenty hard for you. Think about that. That was really where most of the debates were around. Smith, by the way, he never criticized the poor law, even though there was criticism happening in his day. The only critique of the poor law he had was against the law of settlement, which said you had to go back to your city of birth in order to collect, poor relief. And he objected because, your city of birth, you left it because you're actually looking for work in places of job growth. And why should you stop a free labor market? That's a perverse incentive. So he wanted to abolish the law of settlement, but he never said a word against the principle of poverty relief.
Kyle Brennan Marquez.
Hi, this is super interesting. I had two questions. One is, I kept wondering as I was listening to your remarks today and then also reading um, the piece that was circulated just about the secularization question, and whether part of what's going on here is that there's this incredible worry that very much tracks, the classic Weberian account, that what is going to happen unless you cultivate an ideology around industriousness, or around what Weber would refer to as the Protestant kind of model of what to do with your own surplus, is that people are going to reinvest their own sort of surplus. They're going to labor and then stop laboring just at the point where they can basically subsist and essentially direct all their other energy toward pre-existing religious order. And that if we want to build a kind of secular civic order in which people are laboring and then taking the surplus that comes from more and more labor, or more and more marginal output from labor, and investing that into some kind of set of public institutions, common life that is secular in nature, that we kind of need to start telling a story about what should be done with the surplus from the fruits of one's labor, or with the excess time that is freed up or whatnot, that kind of diverts it away from what otherwise might be the kind of unadulterated, Catholic version, just to use, Weber's obviously somewhat problematic terms. So that was the first question. The second question was, I wonder, when do we get this idea that sets in about the landed class, like the rentiers, turning into entrepreneurs? Like, when does it start to become part of this way of thinking on the conservative side, from the capitalist side, that kind of ripens in the popular imagination, and like Ayn Rand, that's maybe like the zenith, right? It's like, when do we start to imagine the aristocrats as like, actually what they're doing is like having great ideas and sort of the engine of innovation, even if we can't see it on the surface, and that's part of the story too here. They're the real laborers in some sense.
So, right, in the classic, economic model, you actually have three classes. You see this explicitly in Ricardo, right? You have the workers, the landowners, and the capitalists. And that was actually literally true about the transformation of English agriculture. So you get massive enclosures in the 19th century, and even in the 18th century, the yeomen get wiped out. So you don't have peasant farmers anymore. They've either become small farmers, or they've become agricultural wage laborers. So you had the landowners, and land was getting more and more concentrated in a few hands through enclosures, and also through the invention of the mortgage. That's how they managed to acquire all that land, because they had to buy out, the people who had property entitlements. Then you have the agricultural laborers, who are basically day laborers. Okay, they're incredibly impoverished in this era. And in the middle, you have capitalist farmers, and the farmers don't own the land. What they have is a stock of capital, which they use to advance wages and buy, certain inputs, seeds and what have you, equipment of various sorts. But basically, all they have is a stock of capital. They don't own land. So you had that classic three-class structure, okay, in English agriculture. And the capitalists, though, of course, were more famous in the Industrial Revolution for starting up the factory system. And essentially what happened was, the capitalist class aspired to own land. Right, so Ricardo himself made a killing in the bond market. Okay, he was a financier kind of capitalist. And then what does he do? Right, he buys a lot of land and he becomes a landowner. And the ideology at the time distinguished between idle landlords and improving landlords, who would be coming from the capitalist class, who had some innovative ideas to increase agricultural productivity. They'd invest in the land. And over time, right, essentially the capitalists, who are making a killing with factories, finance, and modern capitalist, enterprise, they pretty much buy up the land and so you get, or they marry into it. So you get a kind of unification of the landowners and the property owners over the course of the 19th century. But that idea of the improving landlord, that even goes back to Locke. So Locke was a dependent member of the household of the first Earl of Shaftesbury. And Shaftesbury was sort of a model improving landlord, somebody who's like researching a lot on better agricultural techniques and how do you make the land more productive. And so they were considered kind of entrepreneurs of the soil. Although how much they actually improved productivity is very much open to question. Robert Allen, who's I think the premier historian of economics of that era, says that all the productivity gains in yields were actually generated by the yeoman.
All right, so
did I answer your question? Now I get a sense that maybe I didn't fully answer your question.
That's a that answered the second question entirely. It makes complete sense. The first question is about secularization and whether we wanted to sort of the part of what was going on was that there's an impulse to try to sort of push people's energy of all sorts, like kind of private libidinal energy, into the project of creating a kind of common civic world that is secular in nature, and that part of the story about industriousness that we're seeing, and then that Weber's able to kind of give some diagnostic, clarity to, is picking up on this sense that if you don't have a story about what makes for kind of virtuous sense of self as a laborer, what's going to happen is people are going to labor just to the extent that they have to in order to go back and do a whole bunch of highly sort of ritualized, day-to-day traditional
nobody
stuff.
was thinking about that in the 18th century. The peasants definitely not. No, they were so exhausted. They didn't have much going on, even in religious terms. If anything, I think the conservatives were worried that they weren't going to church enough.
So I'll jump in, and this is a question that arises kind of reading the two pieces, the Boston Review piece and the draft chapter together. And we were speaking about this a little bit before everyone came in. But I mean, so what's at stake with calling these things social insurance? Because I mean, my understanding is that that term was not explicitly used by Paine or Bentham or any of these other folks. But in the Boston Review piece, you're talking about Hayek, and in his time, that was the phrase. And so there's some moment between Paine and Hayek when it becomes labeled as insurance. And I ask because my sense is that even in Paine's era, insurance, at least as a legal matter, had this kind of conceptual structure whereby it was supposed to protect it was supposed to protect the stuff you already have and not be a gambling scheme or some mechanism whereby you could become better off than you otherwise would have been. And so there's the insurable interest requirement that prevented you from gambling on other people's lives. And but I imagine it's that structure that makes it difficult to use something that you characterize as social insurance to create what you called in the Boston Review piece an entitlement, like a property right and an entitlement that otherwise wouldn't exist. So anyway, that's the question.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, though, people do have property in their own capacity to labor, and so they're insuring themselves against the loss of that. I think what made Hayek object to that conceptualization, one of the things is that, well, insurance is supposed to be for like accidents, unpredictable things, but everyone eventually gets too old to work. I mean, infirmity and old age eventually is going to set in. And since that's predictable, there's no basis for pooling the risks. I think that's the way he thought of it, because he's thinking about insurance on the private model. So I think, the term social insurance comes in because I think mostly in the 20th century, when you see countries actually designing large-scale systems of social insurance. I mean, Bismarck is a pioneer in the late 19th century. I think it was just a legitimation tool, right? Especially in the United States, against the background of very intense individualism, which you see reflected in Priestley's outlook. And that's also the reason why social insurance was founded on taxes on wages rather than taxes on capital, the way Paine wanted it to be. That was explicitly an attempt to say, you give people a sense, well, I earned it, right? So you can't take it away from me. That if the social insurance came from general revenues, it would be more vulnerable to just getting cut back. But if people had paid into it over their working lives, and then somebody threatens them with a cutback, they'll have a revolt.
Got it. And so just as a sort of historical, like a history of ideas matter, was there a phrase that was used before the phrase social insurance became the norm to describe these types of schemes, you know, like, or were they just talking about the poor law and their, you know?
Talking about this is sort of a superior to the poor law, precisely because it's universal and hence not stigmatizing. And also because, you know, you abolish the means test, it also frees you from bureaucratic scrutiny and from the administrative burdens, like all the paperwork trying to prove that you're really poor and you're really deserving and, you know, this kind of stuff. You don't have to do all that. You just sort of, right? You just get it as a property entitlement.
Right.
Do they have a name for that? Like, what was, I think that was Travis's question. It's like, what do you call
You know,
that
it's
thing?
interesting. I don't see a unified vocabulary for this in this era. They're just sort of like proposing schemes. I mean, they figured that it was packaged in the form of an annuity. So there's a lot of talk about annuities.
Fascinating. Okay, great. That answers the question. Thank you. So Dan R sent me a question. Do you want to chime in, Dan?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious, kind of a basic question, but you know what, and someone else alluded to it, but you know what accounts for the persistence of these ideas and debates, despite the historical changes. You know, just curious as to why they still seem so relevant.
Yeah, because you know, it's a remarkable fact when you do intellectual history, you realize how much we're still the prisoners of the past. You know, it's like if you go to France, people are still arguing over the French Revolution. I've been told that in France, the journals on, you know, there are of course many academic journals on the French Revolution, but they're divided into pro and con. Right? You don't see that in the United States because we don't fight over the French Revolution, but they do. Right? These things, it's like they have incredible staying power, but part of it is because, and this is one of my projects, is to show that the work ethic, it's a very powerful set of ideas. I mean, it still deeply motivates us. They're normatively very powerful ideas, and I want to make that explicit because I think in certain ways, like neoliberal discourse, in certain ways, kind of effaces the power of the work ethic, which I think is driving even people like Hayek. You know, Hayek wants to say, "Oh, it's just about markets." Well, no, because and even though he disavows the idea that markets reward people in accordance with desert, and I think he's correct about that, in popular culture, people definitely think that they deserve their market outcomes, especially if they're favorable.
Thank you.
Great. The queue is open. We have time for, I imagine, one, maybe two more questions.
All right, can I come back in then just quickly? So on this last slide here, you are pointing to, I think, a kind of idea that in its very exaggerated form, and I know you were much more subtle than this, but it basically says, look, we could have any social arrangements we want to. Incomes are not generated by fundamental economic processes. They're generated by whatever rights we assign, and we could assign rights any way we like. If you have entitlements to do X, Y, and Z, which you don't have now, that'll change things, but those are certainly on the table. So where's the role for, I don't know, something like fundamental economic forces? Do you believe that, or did they ever believe that, or did they just sort of say, look, we're writing on a blank slate here. We can design institutions any which way we like, and some will work better than others, but yeah, we're just free to choose, not in the Milton Friedman sense. Any setup that we envision is fair and just.
So I actually think people they weren't like such radical sort of legal positivists. Both sides in this debate are deeply informed by the work ethic and those values. So they do want to arrange property law, market regulation, and so forth in such a way as to both simultaneously promote and justly reward people who satisfy the demands of the work ethic. That's for Paine too. So Paine has a very sharp distinction between the fruits of our labor, which can't be legitimately taxed because we earned it all, we deserve it, and all this other stuff, right? Passive capital returns, essentially, which could be freely taxed away because that's just, that's just a product of artificial property rights. And you see these kinds of, Mill actually has a somewhat similar view. It's more economically sophisticated than Paine, and there's a lot of complexities in his view, but he's really not that different. I mean, he does have a much stronger kind of utilitarian framework through which to see these things, and he translates it also through concern about incentive effects and so forth in a much more sophisticated way, because he's like a serious economist. But really, they don't think that we can rejigger this however we like. There are underlying moral principles that constrain, just economic arrangements.
But those are moral principles rather than economic principles. Like, there's nothing, if we thought it was bad, we wouldn't do it, but nothing particular about, well, you have to provide these kind of incentives or whatever.
Oh, no, I mean, they also accept that you need incentives. Yeah, so that's why they're arguing over the labor supply curve.
Great. Well, on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank Professor Anderson for joining us. It's fascinating, and it's great to have folks from non-law departments sharing their wisdom with us. So looking forward to seeing a lot of you here in 2 weeks. Thanks for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you all.